Number 10. The Lebombo Bone. 29 marks from the edge of human memory. The first message in this investigation does not look like a message at all. It is a small piece of bone, darkened by age and marked along one edge with 29 cuts. It came from Blombos Cave in the Lebombo Mountains of southern Africa, a rock shelter whose layers preserve an extraordinary span of human life. The notched object is associated with deposits dating back more than 40,000 years, to a world before farms, before pottery, before permanent towns, and tens of thousands of years before anyone formed words into an accepted writing system. The object is usually known as the Lebombo Bone, often identified as a baboon fibula. It is small enough to disappear in the palm of a hand. There are no animal figures carved across it, no dramatic faces, no script that can be compared with later alphabets. There is only repetition. One incision, then another, cut deliberately into a hard surface by someone whose name, voice, and reason for making them have completely vanished. That simplicity is what makes the bone so unsettling. A random scratch can happen during butchery or tool use. A series of repeated cuts suggests intention. Someone held this bone steady. Someone chose an edge, applied a sharp tool, and returned to the surface again and again. The act required attention. It required a reason. Whatever was being counted, remembered, or marked mattered enough to be taken out of the mind and placed into an object that could endure after the moment had passed. For decades, the most famous interpretation has been that the 29 notches may relate to the lunar month. The resemblance is impossible to ignore. The changing moon moves through a cycle of roughly the same number of days. Some have suggested a tally linked to time, bodily cycles, or ritual observation. Others have been more cautious. The bone is broken, meaning the surviving marks may not represent the full original sequence. The notches may have recorded quantities, events, exchanges, or actions whose logic can no longer be recovered. The marks are real, their meaning is not. That boundary matters. The Lebombo Bone is not proof that people 40,000 years ago possessed mathematics in the formal sense later cultures would develop. It is not an ancient calendar that can simply be read by counting its cuts. It is not writing, but it reveals something perhaps more important. The human desire to externalize memory was already present at a depth of time almost impossible to imagine. Long before a scribe pressed signs into clay, a hand was already turning repeated marks into a record. Blombos Cave makes that hand feel less distant. The shelter has yielded evidence of complex organic technologies from early later Stone Age communities, worked bone, wooden implements, personal ornaments and materials, showing people capable of manufacturing, planning, and transmitting skill. The notched bone belongs within that world, not as an isolated miracle, but as one fragment of lives already shaped by tools, shared knowledge, and acts whose meanings did not fossilize as easily as their materials. Imagine the person who carried it. Outside the shelter, the landscape of southern Africa stretched across hills and river valleys populated by animals, plants, and dangers known through experience. Inside, fires burned against stone. A small bone lay in a hand while a sharpened edge bit into it. Perhaps each mark represented a passing night. Perhaps it counted gathered resources, hunting events, people, rituals, or something that has no equivalent in modern thought. The maker knew what the sequence meant. Others may have known as well. The bone only became mysterious when everyone capable of reading it was gone. This is the silence at the center of prehistoric symbolism. Archaeology can identify material, marks, and age. It can study cutting direction, spacing, wear, and context. It can compare similar objects across regions and time, but it cannot bring back the explanation spoken beside a fire more than 40,000 years ago. A symbol without its community is a locked door. The more deliberate the mark appears, the more painful it becomes that the door has no surviving key. The Lebombo Bone begins this countdown because it reduces the entire mystery of prehistoric messages to its purest form. No monument is required, no temple, clay tablet, or hidden archive has to be invented. Only a bone, a cutting edge, and 29 repeated decisions. Humanity had not yet written history, but someone had already understood that a mark could hold something after memory failed. We may never know what was being preserved on that fragment, yet it survived long enough to place us before one of the earliest questions ever carved by a human hand. Not what the marks mean, but why someone in a world so remote believed they needed to last. Number 9. The Ishango Bone. Numbers carved beside an ancient lake. If the Lebombo Bone is a whisper from the edge of human memory, the next object feels like a whisper arranged into columns. It was found near Ishango, on the northern shore of Lake Edward, in what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, within a landscape of volcanic stone and rich waters, where communities once lived by fishing and gathering. The object is small and easy to overlook, a slender bone tool carrying deliberate notches along its surface. Yet those cuts are not scattered randomly. They appear in organized groups, drawing scientists toward a possibility both thrilling and impossible to prove. Someone in the deep Stone Age may have been recording numbers. The Ishango Bone was excavated in the 1950s by Belgian geologist Jean de Heinzelin from deposits, often placed around 20,000 years ago, although its precise chronology remains discussed. At one end is a sharp piece of quartz, suggesting the object may once have served as a working tool. But the surface carries another mystery. 3 columns of carefully cut notches run along the bone, separated into clusters that seem too deliberate to dismiss as idle scratching. One column includes groups, read as 11, 13, 17, and 19. Another seems to pair smaller and larger clusters in relationships. Some observers compare with doubling, 3 beside 6, 4 beside 8, 10 beside 5. A third column has encouraged interpretations involving a total close to 60. Viewed through modern eyes, the bone begins to resemble a calculating device, a calendar, or a record of numerical thinking made thousands of years before known written mathematics. That interpretation is seductive because it transforms the unknown maker into a familiar kind of thinker. We can imagine someone beside the lake tracking moon phases, counting fish catches, measuring exchanges, or preserving a sequence others could verify by touch. But the Ishango Bone refuses to give that comfort completely. Groups that look mathematical to one observer may be practical tallies, decorative rhythm, or records organized according to a purpose no modern category captures. There is no surviving label telling us what was counted. No companion object gives the rules of the marks. No voice from Ishango explains whether the clusters refer to days, nets, animals, ceremonies, or events whose meaning died with the people who understood them. The notches may reflect numerical reasoning, but every proposed solution begins with a modern mind approaching an object created in a lost cultural world. We recognize the order. We cannot prove we recognize the purpose. That uncertainty does not diminish the artifact. It makes it more haunting. The people who lived around Lake Edward fashioned tools, gathered food and transmitted knowledge necessary for survival. If someone carved repeated groups into bone, that act belonged to a life in which memory had value beyond the moment. Whether the marks tracked a moon or a meal, they made information portable. They allowed a thought to leave its maker and remain in another material. The quartz point deepens the mystery. If the bone was a working implement, the record may not have been separated from ordinary life. It could have been carried and used, with marks linked to repeated acts, rather than one abstract inscription. A tool could also be a memory device. A useful object could become an archive without resembling a book. The earliest records may be hidden inside objects. Archaeologists first classify only by practical function. Consider what vanished around it. The shoreline camps, spoken explanations, gestures used in counting, and the people who could look at a row of cuts and understand it immediately are gone. Only the bone survived, detached from the system that made it readable. Researchers can count every notch and test numerical patterns, yet perfect observation cannot restore missing meaning. The artifact preserves structure without a dictionary. The Ishango Bone is often presented as one of the world's earliest mathematical objects. Perhaps it is. Perhaps it records a mind manipulating quantities long before numbers were written in language. But its deeper power comes from the distance between possibility and proof. The rows of marks look as though they are about to speak. They invite us to see calculation, planning, and memory stretching beyond a single day. Then they fall silent where interpretation would become certainty. At number 10, 29 incisions showed that someone had already understood the permanence of a repeated mark. Here, the marks gather into columns and relationships that feel dangerously close to a system. Beside an ancient African lake, a human hand carved order into bone, and left it behind. We can still count every cut, but whatever the maker once read from those columns disappeared with a world that did not leave us the key. Number 8. The Diepkloof eggshell code. Symbols carried across the Stone Age in a rock shelter overlooking the dry landscapes of South Africa's Western Cape. Archaeologists found fragments of something that once carried more than water. They were pieces of ostrich eggshell, broken from containers made by people living around 60,000 years ago. An ostrich egg could be pierced, emptied, and used as a lightweight canteen, a precious object where stored water could decide whether a journey ended in survival or death. But many fragments from Diepkloof rock shelter carried another feature: lines cut deliberately across their surfaces, repeated in patterns too ordered to be accidental. Hundreds of engraved fragments came from Howisson's port layers, a Middle Stone Age world of tools, fire and movement through difficult terrain. Some pieces show long parallel lines crossed by shorter strokes, creating hatched bands. Others bear sets of straight lines arranged with similar care. These were not random marks made while cracking open an egg or scraping it clean. Microscopic study showed intentional engraving sequences, with one set of lines cut first and others added across them according to a recognizable design. The objects have been broken by time, which makes the original site almost impossible to recover. Imagine a whole eggshell container, rounded and pale, fitted with an opening, and perhaps carried with cord. Across its shell runs a geometric band, clear enough to be recognized while the vessel moved from camp to camp. It was not hidden in a ceremonial chamber. It belonged to ordinary survival. Someone carrying water through the Stone Age also carried a visible sign. That is where Diepkloof becomes more unsettling than a single notched bone. A tally might belong to one moment and one maker. These engraved shells represent a tradition. Similar motifs appear across multiple archaeological layers, showing that people repeated and altered patterns through time. The marks were not invented once and forgotten. They were recognized and reproduced by communities whose spoken explanations vanished more completely than the shells themselves. What did they mean? Ownership is one possibility. In a group moving across dry country, several people might carry nearly identical water containers, and patterns could identify an individual, family, or wider community. The designs may also have expressed belonging or status. They could have held meanings impossible to separate now from daily life, where utility, memory, and identity were not divided into modern categories. But there is an important boundary. The Diepkloof engravings are not a deciphered alphabet. They do not form sentences that can be translated. There is no proof that each stroke corresponded to a word, sound, or number. Calling them writing would go farther than the evidence permits, yet dismissing them as decoration would miss what survived. Their regularity, repetition, and placement on portable objects suggest a graphic system understood by people within that world. A message does not need to behave like modern text in order to communicate. The material makes the mystery sharper. Ostrich eggshell is strong enough to carry water, but fragile enough that most containers eventually cracked and scattered. Thousands of years reduced patterned vessels into isolated fragments. A fragment preserves only part of a design. Archaeologists can compare fragments and track motifs, but they cannot rebuild every original container, much less recover the rules by which the patterns were understood. The archive survives like shredded pages from a language that may never have been spoken aloud. Diepkloof forces us to confront how advanced symbolic life already was in the Middle Stone Age. Long before agriculture or cities, they made containers and marked useful objects with designs maintained across generations. Their world was not silent or mentally unfinished. It was filled with conventions and shared memory, most of which left nothing durable behind. Somewhere around 60,000 years ago, a person took a shell that might keep water alive on a journey and engraved lines into its surface. The vessel moved through a landscape whose names are gone, seen by people who understood the pattern without needing to explain it. Eventually it broke, and the pieces entered the shelter floor. The container disappeared, but the marks survived. At Lebombo and Ishango, Bone preserved sequences that might have counted something. At Diepkloof, the message spreads onto objects made to travel between human hands. We still cannot read it, but we can see that it was meant to be seen. In the scraped geometry of broken eggshells lies a disturbing truth. 60,000 years before writing, human beings were already carrying signs through the world, and whatever those signs once said vanished with the people who knew their meaning. Number 7. The Jiahu signs. Marks that appeared thousands of years before Chinese writing in the fields of Henan province, China, beneath the remains of a Neolithic settlement called Jiahu. Archaeologists uncovered a world already more complex than its age seems to allow. Between roughly 7,000 and 5,700 BC, people there built houses, farmed, fished, and buried their dead with carefully chosen objects. Among those grave goods were flutes made from crane bones, tortoise shells, and fragments of bone bearing small incised marks. The signs are simple. Their implications are not. Jiahu existed thousands of years before the oracle bone inscriptions of the Shang dynasty, the earliest widely accepted body of Chinese writing. Those later inscriptions, carved into turtle shells and animal bones, recorded questions and ritual acts. The Jiahu marks appear on similar kinds of material, but they are separated from Shang writing by an immense gulf of time. If they represented even an early ancestor of that tradition, the history of recorded signs in China would reach far deeper than the confirmed record allows. Some of the Jiahu objects came from burials. A tortoise shell placed with the dead was not discarded refuse. It had entered a deliberate ritual setting on several shells and bones. Researchers identified individual signs cut with intention, angular forms, crossed lines, and shapes that seem designed rather than accidental. Some have been compared with much later Chinese signs. The comparison is haunting, but resemblance across millennia is not translation. That caution is essential. Jiahu did not yield a library of inscriptions, a sentence, a repeated grammatical pattern, or any key for decipherment. The signs are few and isolated, far older than a proven script. They may have been clan marks, ownership signs, ritual identifiers, counting devices, or symbols connected to ceremonies involving the dead. They may have carried meaning only in an act, a shell handled, displayed, or buried while words were spoken aloud. A mark can communicate without functioning as written language, yet it is difficult to look at these objects without sensing that something has begun. At Jiahu, signs were incised onto bone and tortoise shell in burials beside the dead. It had become a place where an idea could be fixed and recognized after the person who made it was gone. Tortoise shell makes the discovery especially unsettling. Much later in Chinese history, shells and bones became surfaces on which questions were addressed to ancestors and invisible powers. Jiahu is far too early to prove that this same divination tradition already existed, and its signs cannot honestly be called oracle bone writing. But marked shells in Neolithic graves show that durable surfaces already carried meaning before readable history. Imagine one burial being prepared at Jiahu. A community gathers around a grave. Among the objects lowered with the dead is a tortoise shell, hard and curved, carrying a sign everyone present understands immediately. Perhaps it marks a lineage, a role, a memory, or a protective act. The shell enters the earth, the ceremony ends. The explanation survives only in voices that never reach us, while the mark waits in silence for more than 8,000 years. This is the cruelty of early symbols. Closer they appear to writing, the more intensely we want them to confess. We expect marks to reveal language, because language is how our own histories survive. But Jiahu stands at a threshold where meaning may have been recorded without any structure that lets outsiders recover it. The sign remains deliberate while the message becomes unreachable. No one needs to invent a forbidden Neolithic book to make Jiahu mysterious. The real artifacts are enough. People carved signs into shell and bone long before the first confirmed Chinese texts, and they carried some of those signs into graves. Perhaps these marks were distant steps on the road to writing. Perhaps they belonged to a symbolic tradition that disappeared without descendants. Either possibility leaves the same unsettling absence. More than 8,000 years ago, a human hand cut a small mark into a tortoise shell and placed it where death, ritual, and memory met. Today, we can see the line, measure it, and compare it with symbols carved millennia later. What we cannot do is read it. The people of Jiahu left marks that resemble the edge of language, but whatever they once said was buried long before history learned how to listen. Number 6. The Abauntz map stone. A landscape carved before maps had names or message, does not always preserve a number, a name, or a ritual sign. Sometimes it preserves a place. In Blombos Cave, In the foothills of the Pyrenees in northern Spain, archaeologists recovered a small engraved stone block from near the end of the last ice age. Its surface is crowded with intersecting lines, shapes and animal figures, marks that could seem chaotic at first glance. Yet when researchers studied how those lines related to the land outside the cave, a remarkable possibility emerged. The stone may be one of the oldest surviving maps made by human hands. The block dates to the late Magdalenian period, more than 13,000 years ago, when hunter-gatherer communities moved through valleys shaped by cold climate, rivers, and animal migrations. These people knew territory through repeated journeys, ridges that blocked a path, watercourses through the valley, cliffs where animals passed, and narrow places where an ambush could become survival. Their landscape was not scenery. It was memory, food, risk, and direction, held together in minds that had to read the ground correctly. The engraved stone is not a modern map reduced onto prehistoric material. It has no place names, scale, or clear legend, explaining which line means river and which mark means mountain. But its carved features have been interpreted as a representation of the area surrounding Abauntz Cave. A winding line may correspond to a river course. Other shapes may evoke nearby terrain, passes or hills. Animal engravings appear on the same surface, suggesting that the land and the creatures moving through it may have been recorded together rather than separated into modern categories. If that interpretation is correct, someone performed a startling act of thought. They took a territory too wide to see at once, changing with weather and season and known through walking rather than from above, and translated it into marks small enough to hold. A route remembered through the body became an image on stone. A valley known through hunger, cold and successful hunts became information another person might carry or understand. This is what makes Abauntz different from the objects earlier in this investigation. The Lebombo and Ishango bones may have recorded sequences. The Diepkloof eggshells may have communicated ownership or identity. The Jiahu signs may have belonged to ritual or emerging symbolic practice. At Abauntz, the marks may reach outward into the physical world itself. They may preserve not only that people were making signs, but that signs could stand for places no longer directly in front of them. There is no proof that the stone was used as a hunting guide spread before a group around a fire. Its lines may have held meanings partly symbolic, partly narrative, or entirely different from the cartographic reading proposed by researchers. Prehistoric art rarely allows a clean translation. A carved animal can refer to prey, story, or memory. A winding line can look like a river, because we want a map, while its maker may have understood it another way. The object cannot confirm the argument. It preserves only the arrangement that made the argument possible. But imagine why such a stone might have mattered. Outside the cave, herds moved through seasonal terrain. A hunter who remembered the bend of a river or the narrowing of a valley possessed knowledge that could feed others. A younger person might learn from someone tracing a finger across carved stone. Perhaps the block was not a map in the modern sense, but a surface used during explanation. Here the animals pass. Here the river turns, here the ridge closes, here we wait. That knowledge almost never survives. Spoken directions die with the speaker, tracks disappear in rain, wooden markers rot, paths vanish when rivers cut new courses. Even the names given to a valley are erased when the people who spoke them disappear. Stone offers one rare exception. Lines carved into its surface can continue long after both traveler and territory have changed. The Abauntz block does not need to be declared the first map with certainty to be extraordinary. It shows an Ice Age mind arranging marks in a way that may have connected animals, movement, and landscape on a portable surface. More than 13,000 years later, we can compare stone lines to real valleys, searching for a relationship its maker may once have understood immediately. At Jiahu, a sign buried with the dead suggested meaning preserved without translation. At Abauntz, the possible message is a world underfoot, ridges, river bends and prey routes compressed into engraved stone. The map, if it is a map, has outlived every word once used to explain it. We may still walk the land it describes, but we will never hear the person who carved it say where the lines were meant to lead. Number 5. The Blombos ochre. The pattern that survived 75,000 years on the southern coast of South Africa, Blombos Cave opens toward an ocean that has watched human history vanish in layers of sand. Inside, archaeologists recovered shells, bone tools, pigments, and traces of people who lived long before farming or cities. Among the finds was a piece of red ochre, small enough to rest inside a closed hand. Its surface had been deliberately flattened, then cut with lines that crossed one another in a geometric pattern. The object was about 75,000 years old. Whatever the marks meant, they had survived from a world without any writing system we know how to read. Ochre is iron-rich stone that can be ground into red pigment. Prehistoric people used it for coloring bodies, decorating objects, preparing compounds, or performing acts whose meaning no longer survives. The Blombos specimen reveals intention of a different order. Someone prepared the surface, drew a sharp tool across it, and created a controlled design of diagonal lines crossed by other strokes. It was not the accidental result of scraping pigment powder. The geometry was placed there to be seen. That distinction pushed Blombos into arguments about the origins of symbolic thought. At the time the engraving was made, human beings had no pottery, no metal, no crops, no cities, and no alphabet. Yet someone was already taking an abstract form from the mind and fixing it onto a durable surface. This was not an animal copied from nature or a practical cutting edge. It was a pattern, a shape whose importance existed because people recognized something in its lines. The cave did not produce only one isolated clue. Other engraved ochre pieces, beads made from shell, and carefully worked materials reveal a community capable of ornament, planning, and repeated symbolic behavior. Blombos is disturbing not because it proves an ancient lost script, but because it destroys the comforting idea that symbolism appeared suddenly with civilization. By the time later societies began writing names, harvests, and laws onto clay, human minds had already spent immense stretches of time turning thought into visible marks. Still, the cross-hatch is not a sentence. It cannot be translated. Researchers cannot claim that one line stood for water, a person, a lineage, or a dream. The design could have marked identity, memory, ritual affiliation, aesthetic preference, or an idea outside all modern categories. It may have been meaningful to a community, or only to the person who made it. The evidence can prove the pattern was intentional. It cannot return the explanation spoken beside it. That silence makes the object more powerful than any invented prehistoric manuscript. A fictional book offers pages, knowledge, and a reason it was hidden. The Blombos ochre offers something real and less forgiving, meaning without recovery. A hand made the pattern. Other hands at the site worked pigment, shell and bone within a world rich enough in symbols to leave evidence behind. But every story that connected those marks to living people disappeared, leaving only red stone and incised lines beneath cave sediment. Imagine the act itself. A person sits near the mouth of the cave while wind moves over the southern coast. The ochre is held steady. A sharpened point presses into its surface, dragging pale grooves through deep red mineral. Line after line crosses the previous ones until the form is complete. Perhaps someone else watches and understands immediately. Perhaps the object is kept, ground down later, or abandoned among daily remains. Nothing about that moment was intended for us, yet the mark endured after the language, gesture, and memory surrounding it had gone. Red ochre appears again and again in the human past, connected to bodies, objects, and burials, though its meaning changes across place and time. At Blombos, the mineral was not only made into pigment, it became a surface for design. The same material that could stain skin or tools was used to hold an abstract pattern. Something normally turned into color was turned into a record. At Abauntz, engraved lines may have reduced a landscape to portable memory. At Blombos, the lines lead inward, toward the moment human beings began making signs whose reference is no longer visible in the outside world. The marks do not tell us where to travel or what to count. They confront us with an idea. 75,000 years ago, someone believed a pattern mattered enough to carve permanently into stone. The red ochre survived. The person did not. The society that understood the design did not. We are left staring at a geometry made by our own species, in an age so distant that nearly all of its meanings have been erased. It may not be writing, and it may never have been meant as a message to the future. But it is a thought made visible before history, and after 75,000 years, it still refuses to explain itself. Number 4. The Shigir idol. The wooden message saved by a bog. Most prehistoric messages were written on the wrong material to survive. Stone can endure, bone can cross thousands of years. Ochre may remain beneath cave sediment until a modern hand lifts it into light. Wood usually disappears, taking whatever faces, signs or memories were carved into it away forever. That is why an object recovered from a peat bog in the Ural Mountains is so unsettling. It is not simply an ancient statue, it is evidence of a symbolic world made in wood that almost never had a chance to reach us. In 1890, workers extracting peat from the Shiga bog in what is now Russia encountered fragments of carved larch wood buried deep beneath the wet ground. Reassembled, they formed a towering anthropomorphic figure known as the Shigir idol. Later dating pushed its age back, more than 11,000 years old, made near the beginning of the Holocene, when the Ice Age world was giving way to forests and wetlands. It is older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids, older than the first cities, and older than any accepted writing system. The figure originally stood over 5 meters tall. At its upper end is a human-like face, narrow and watchful, gazing out from a time before farming transformed much of the world. Down its long wooden body run geometric designs, zigzags, horizontal bands, angled lines and additional face, like forms arranged one above another. Nothing about it looks casual. Someone selected a larch tree, cut and shaped it with stone tools, then covered the surface with ordered imagery. The act required planning, and a reason strong enough to turn a tree into a figure, meant to outlast the people standing before it. What did the patterns mean? No one knows. The faces may represent spirits, ancestors, or guardians. The zigzags may refer to water, movement, boundaries, danger, or ideas for which modern language has no faithful equivalent. It is tempting to call the idol a wooden book, a sequence of messages carved down its body, but there is no translation and no surviving community able to explain the imagery. Shigir is not writing in any proven sense. It is something more frustrating, deliberate communication without a key. Its survival depended on the bog. Waterlogged peat contains little oxygen, slowing the decay that would normally consume wood. Instead of rotting away, the larch remained sealed in darkness. That preservation exposes the scale of what is missing. Prehistoric people living in forests could have carved posts, masks, ritual markers, ancestor figures and signs through thousands of generations. Almost all of them would have vanished. Shigir may be exceptional because nearly every other wooden message was erased by ordinary nature. Archaeology reconstructs early symbolic life from what durable materials allow us to find: cave walls, engraved rocks, ochre fragments and bones. A world that placed much of its meaning into wood would leave behind a distorted silence. The most important images could be the least likely to survive. The idol is a warning that the record may preserve only a fraction of the symbols people once surrounded themselves with. Imagine the idol when it was new. Fresh larch stood pale against a northern landscape of water, birch and pine. Carved faces were sharp, the zigzags clean, perhaps darkened by smoke or pigment. People looked at it and understood something immediately. They may have gathered near it or placed it beside a location whose importance needed no written description. We cannot know whether it meant protection, remembrance, fear, or obligation. We know only that it was made to be seen, and that its makers believed a carved object could hold meaning beyond the life of the tree it came from. Even this rare survivor did not reach us completely intact. Early reconstructions documented pieces that later became lost, meaning parts of its original design are now known only through drawings made after discovery. The pattern is painfully familiar. An object survives 11,000 years in darkness, reaches modern hands, and still begins to lose parts of itself. The idol is a message whose meaning vanished in prehistory, and whose physical form continued to fracture in history. At Blombos, red ochre protected an abstract design cut tens of thousands of years ago. At Shigir, a bog protected a towering wooden figure covered with deliberate signs. We can date the tree, examine its marks and count the faces that remain. But whatever its makers knew when they looked upward at it is gone. The Shigir idol survived because the earth denied it decay. Its meaning received no such protection. More than 11,000 years later, its faces are still staring from the wood, while the people who understood them remain silent. If prehistoric humanity ever filled forests with messages carved into timber, this may be one of the only pages nature accidentally refused to erase. Number 3. Nabta Playa. The sky written in desert stones before the Sahara became one of the most hostile landscapes on Earth. Parts of it breathed with seasonal water. In the Nubian desert of southern Egypt, rain once gathered in shallow basins, drawing cattle, herding communities into a region now almost empty. At Nabta Playa, those people left behind hearths, cattle burials, stone arrangements, and a small circle of upright slabs. Nothing on those stones resembles an alphabet, yet placed beneath an open sky, they may preserve one of the oldest surviving attempts to turn the movements of the heavens into memory on the ground. Nabta Playa was studied by archaeologists in the 1970s, when Fred Wendorf and his team examined prehistoric remains across the desert basin. The site belongs largely to the Neolithic period, thousands of years before the pharaohs built pyramids along the Nile. During wetter phases, groups returned as water appeared, bringing livestock and creating ceremonial spaces. The desert visible today conceals a different world. People gathering beside seasonal water, relying on the timing of rain to determine whether families and animals survived. Among the most discussed remains is a stone circle only a few meters across. Several slabs have been interpreted as alignments connected to the summer solstice, the season when rains would have mattered most. In a place where water arrived and vanished again, recognizing the turning point of the year was not abstract astronomy. It was survival, ceremony, and expectation joined together. The stones may have transformed a recurring moment in the sky into something a community could return to long after the first observers were dead. That is where Nabta Playa becomes a message before writing. The builders did not need to carve a sentence describing the sunrise. They could position stones so the horizon itself completed the record. At the right time of year, light and shadow would make the arrangement meaningful again. A generation could disappear, the stones could remain, waiting for the sun to return to the same edge of the desert. More ambitious interpretations have made the site famous beyond archaeology. Some researchers have proposed alignments involving stars, while others have argued for far more elaborate astronomical knowledge encoded in the layout. Those claims are debated, and Nabta Playa should not be presented as proof that a lost prehistoric civilization mapped the heavens with modern precision. The strongest evidence needs no exaggeration. A community arranged stones deliberately in a ceremonial landscape, in a way plausibly tied to seasonal cycles. That alone is extraordinary. The structures also stood beside cattle burials and other ritual features. Cattle were not simply food. They were survival, wealth, and perhaps a bridge between human communities and powers believed to control water and fertility. If stones marked a celestial moment, they may have belonged to ceremonies in which the sky was addressed through offerings, gathering, and memory. We cannot divide astronomy from belief here as cleanly as a modern observatory separates measurement from ritual. Imagine the playa while it still held water. The horizon is flat, the night sky unbroken by anything except fire and stars. People who know every change in wind and cloud gather beside stones already seen by their parents. At dawn on a crucial day, the sun rises where the placement of stone says it should. Perhaps this confirms the season, perhaps it begins a ceremony, perhaps it tells the community when to expect rain or danger. No written word is necessary when everyone present understands what the arrangement means. Then the climate changed, the wet phases withdrew, the desert dried, and communities connected to Nabta Playa moved toward more dependable water, including the Nile Valley. Whatever spoken knowledge accompanied the stones went with them. The arrangements remained in a landscape stripped of the conditions that gave them purpose. We can measure orientation and reconstruct ancient horizons. We cannot recover the words once spoken there, or know whether the stones were a calendar, a sanctuary, a memory device, or all of these at once. At Shiga, carved wood survived only because a bog refused to let it rot. At Nabta Playa, meaning survived in a more severe form, as stones standing in relation to a sky that still moves above them. Long before formal writing, people in North Africa had discovered that knowledge could be fixed into a landscape and carried forward by repetition. Nabta Playa may not be a star map in the legendary sense, and no buried codex is needed beneath its sands. Its real mystery is enough. Someone positioned stones so the heavens could be read from the earth. Thousands of years later, the sky still completes the message. But the people who knew how to interpret it are gone. Number 2. The Vinna signs and the TRT Ria tablets, writing before Sumer. If the marks in this investigation have moved steadily closer to something resembling language, the next case stands at a fault line. In Neolithic southeastern Europe, long before Mesopotamian city-states, people marked pottery, figurines and clay objects with repeated signs. Crosses, chevrons, grids and angular symbols appear across Vinna material culture. They recur deliberately, and because many are thousands of years older than the first widely accepted scripts, they force a dangerous question: were people in prehistoric Europe recording meaning before Sumer? The Vinna world spread through parts of present-day Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, and nearby regions during the 6th and 5th millennia BC. These were settled farming communities with houses, ceramics, and ritual objects. Their signs appear repeatedly, sometimes isolated on vessels, sometimes gathered in clusters. Their recurrence suggests a symbolic convention understood by more than one maker. But repetition alone does not prove language. A potter's mark, sacred emblem, or ownership sign can be standardized without forming a sentence. Then, in 1961, 3 small clay tablets reportedly emerged from TRT Ria in Transylvania. Romania too were pierced with holes. One was round, only a few centimeters across. Their surfaces carried abstract signs, divided sections and imagery that seemed uncannily close to an inscription. Found with other objects in a context interpreted by some researchers as ritual, the tablets became immediately explosive. If their early dating was correct, they belonged to a period far earlier than Mesopotamian proto-cuneiform. If their symbols were writing, the origin story of recorded language would fracture. Controversy followed them from the beginning. Their excavation circumstances were not recorded with the precision archaeology would demand, and their dating depends heavily on context rather than direct measurement. After discovery, the unfired clay was treated for conservation, complicating later attempts to date the tablets themselves. They are not a clean text waiting to be translated. They are a mystery already altered by the history of their recovery. The deeper problem is what a sign must do before we call it writing. A clan symbol, ritual image or property mark can carry meaning without encoding speech. A script must preserve information systematically enough to express language or accounts beyond one immediate act. The Vinna signs may have been meaningful. The surviving corpus does not provide an agreed grammar, a bilingual key or an archive anyone can read. Yet dismissing them as decoration is equally unsatisfying. These communities chose specific surfaces, repeated specific forms, and arranged marks deliberately. The TRT Ria tablets do not look like scratches made in passing. Someone shaped clay, cut symbols into it and placed the objects within a meaningful setting. Whether those marks communicated spoken words, ritual identity, or an idea outside language itself, they were created to be recognized. Imagine the moment without claiming more than the evidence allows. In a Neolithic settlement of the Danube world, wet clay is formed into small tablets. Pointed tool cuts a divided panel. An angular mark, a sign familiar to the maker. The object is dried, used, or deposited. Everyone capable of explaining it eventually disappears. Thousands of years later, writing emerges elsewhere and becomes readable because it leaves larger archives behind. These earlier signs remain stranded in silence, close enough to text to disturb us, but too isolated to confess what they were. That is why the TRT Ria tablets are more unsettling than a confirmed inscription would be. A readable tablet would settle its identity. These objects preserve the argument. They may belong to a Neolithic sign system used for ritual or authority. They may be proto-writing that approached language without fully becoming it. Or, if the most dramatic interpretation were ever proven, they would force history to admit that writing began in a place and time it failed to recognize. At Nabta Playa, stones may have stored knowledge through the movements of the sky. With the Vinna signs and the TRT Ria tablets, meaning appears compressed onto small objects that could be handled and buried. They look almost like pages from a system no later civilization preserved. But almost is the word that keeps the mystery alive. More than 7,000 years after a hand marked those clay surfaces, we can photograph every line and compare every sign. What we cannot do is ask the question that matters most. Did the maker believe these marks could speak after they were gone? If the answer was yes, then somewhere in prehistoric Europe, people stood closer to writing than the accepted story once allowed, and the message they left behind is still waiting. Number 1. Göbekli Tepe. The stone archive its builders chose to bury the final message in this investigation is not small enough to hold in the hand. It rises from a hill in southeastern Turkey, in circles of carved limestone, built by people who lived before cities and thousands of years before the first accepted writing systems. Göbekli Tepe does not contain a confirmed alphabet or a hidden book waiting to be translated. Its mystery is harder to escape. More than 11,000 years ago, human beings built a monumental place crowded with imagery. Then major parts of it were sealed beneath earth and rubble. The hill had been noted in an earlier survey, but its significance became clear after Klaus Schmidt began investigating the site in the 1990s. Beneath the mound were monumental enclosures dating back to the pre-pottery Neolithic, beginning around 9600 BC. At their centers stood enormous T-shaped pillars, some taller than a person and weighing many tons. Around them rose additional pillars cut from local limestone, shaped and positioned by communities that had not yet created the urban world once believed necessary for monumental architecture. The pillars are not blank. Foxes, boars, serpents, scorpions, vultures, and other wild creatures move across their surfaces in relief. Some T-shaped stones carry carved arms and hands folded across narrow bodies, suggesting that the pillars themselves may represent beings rather than supports. Other signs recur without yielding an agreed meaning. They are not writing in any demonstrated sense, but they are not meaningless decoration. They belong to a symbolic world whose explanations are gone. That is why Göbekli Tepe belongs at the end of this countdown. The Lebombo Bone offered repeated cuts. Ishango gathered marks into structured groups. Diepkloof carried patterns across water containers. Jiahu placed signs beside the dead. Abauntz may have reduced landscape to portable memory. Blombos trapped abstract geometry in red ochre. Shigir preserved wooden imagery that should have rotted away. Nabta Playa arranged seasonal memory beneath the sky. The Vin Assigns and TRT Ria tablets approached the troubling edge of recorded language. At Göbekli Tepe, the message becomes an entire built environment. Imagine the labor behind it. Limestone is quarried from the plateau with stone tools. A pillar is shaped, dragged, and raised. Animals are carved into its surface with shared intention. People gather inside the enclosures beneath an open sky. They know why one animal appears beside another, why two pillars stand at the center. To us, the carvings are evidence. To them, they were part of a living system of meaning. Then the enclosures ceased to function as they once had. Early monumental spaces were filled with stones, animal bone, flint and debris, covering the pillars beneath the mound. Researchers continue to debate exactly how the infilling occurred and what it meant. But the effect is undeniable. The carved world entered darkness, preserved for millennia, while its explanation disappeared. Whether this was ritual closure, transformation, abandonment, or another practice we cannot reconstruct. No readable account explains why these spaces were buried. This is where legend tries to enter. It is tempting to imagine tablets hidden below the floors, a forbidden stone codex, or a prehistoric script buried because it knew too much. No such book has been found. No carved slab has revealed a lost alphabet older than Sumer. But inventing one weakens the reality. Göbekli Tepe is already a stone archive without a translation, an enormous symbolic project created at a time when older histories once assumed communities could not organize meaning on this scale. The greatest loss is not an artifact stolen from the site. It is the interpretation that died with its builders. We can excavate the fill, photograph every relief, and date the enclosures. What we cannot retrieve is the grammar of the place. We do not know what a vulture meant on a pillar, whether a fox marked a story, a group, a danger, or a being beyond the visible world. We do not know what was spoken inside those circles, or what covering them meant to the people carrying earth over the stones. Göbekli Tepe proves prehistoric people did not need writing to preserve meaning in forms powerful enough to cross 11,000 years. They carved their world into pillars. They arranged memory into stone. Then those spaces were buried beneath a hill, leaving later humanity with images. It can see perfectly and understand only in fragments. There may never be a hidden codex at Göbekli Tepe. There does not need to be. The pillars themselves are the unreadable pages. Their animals still move across limestone. And the builders left us no alphabet, no translation, and no final explanation. They left only a monument made before history, carrying a message that survived long enough to be found, but not long enough to be read.